Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking at the power of voice and how much it really matters. I mean, think about it. Sometimes we take it for granted, but when we see what's happening in other parts of the world, speaking freely, being heard, it's definitely not something everyone has.
Yeah, it's a right, not a given right.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is the sources we're looking at today, they kind of show that contrast, right? You see the silencing of women in Afghanistan with the Taliban's rule.
Really stark contrast.
And then you have someone like Heather Cox Richardson.
Yeah, she's got a massive following, right,
Right.
through her writing. A historian, building a global audience. I mean, it makes you stop and think about just how different things are depending on where you are in the world.
It really does. And speaking of those differences, let's start with Afghanistan. The Taliban's laws, they came out in 2024, and wow, pretty shocking. Women can't speak, they can't sing, they can't even read aloud in public. Can you imagine being told you can't use your voice just because you're a woman? It's wild, right? It's like they're trying to systemically erase women from public life, and the effects of that are enormous, right? Like think about it. Education, work, leadership positions.
Right.
I mean, basically, the sources talk about it as like a potential loss of a whole generation of female doctors, engineers, journalists, and leaders. It's a huge deal.
Yeah, the UN Special Rapporteur even called it a generational catastrophe, which I think really captures the severity of it.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about those discussions that are happening about Afghanistan's future, like even the UN talks in Doha. Our sources say that, for the most part, women are absent.
Right, and that's exactly the point. You exclude half the population from making these huge decisions and, well, their needs, their perspectives, they're not even part of the conversation.
It's pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
And the effects are going to be long-lasting too, right? It's going to shape the whole direction of the country.
For sure.
And it's easy to hear this and think, oh, this is just a problem over there.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, you realize these barriers, they exist everywhere, don't they?
Absolutely. I mean, even just thinking about women in professional settings, right? They face an uphill battle just to be heard, to speak up. Like one of the sources talked about this study from 2007 from the Journal of Applied Psychology. It found that women who exhibited traits, ambition-related traits, like being assertive, taking charge, they were actually penalized during hiring.
It's so frustrating. So if she's too aggressive, she's seen as a problem. But if she's not assertive enough, she's overlooked. It's a no-win situation.
It can feel that way for sure.
What's worse is I feel like the media kind of makes things worse.
Yeah.
They portray these ambitious women negatively, so it just reinforces the stereotype.
It's a vicious cycle, right? So it makes it even harder for women to get to those top spots, to get to those leadership roles.
Yeah, and that might explain why the World Economic Forum, they predict that we're almost a century away from gender parity in leadership.
It's crazy. A whole century.
It's bleak, honestly. It makes you wonder if real change is even possible.
It is a bit discouraging. But, I mean, change never happens overnight, right?
It's a process.
It takes time and effort and, a willingness to kind of challenge those existing structures and systems. And honestly, I think these sources, they highlight a key point. We need to understand, why are those stereotypes there in the first place, right? Where do they come from? How are they being reinforced? Because it's not enough to just acknowledge it. We've got to dig deeper if we want to create real, lasting change.
Absolutely. So we've talked about some of the more difficult stuff, but let's switch gears a little bit. Our sources, they have some pretty inspiring stories about women using these online platforms to find their voice. And it's amazing the change they've made.
Oh, yeah. Some real success stories. Heather Cox Richardson's stories are a great example. So she's a historian, and she's built this huge following through her newsletter, Letters from an American, which is on Substack. And what's really interesting is she's not just sharing boring historical facts, she's connecting history to what's happening right now, and people love it.
Yeah, and she's reportedly making over $1 million a month doing it. It's incredible.
It's crazy, right?
It shows you the power of these platforms. They give people a way to kind of bypass the traditional gatekeepers and connect directly with people who appreciate their work, who want to hear what they have to say.
I think what's key is that she found her niche, and she's built this community around it. And, people, we're hungry for information, good information, especially now when there's just so much noise and misinformation out there.
Right.
So she's cutting through all of that, and it's clearly working. It's a smart strategy, and it shows how individuals can use these platforms to build their own platforms, and to make a real impact.
It's so true. And Richardson, she's not alone in this. You think about Malala Yousafzai. She used social media to share her story, and advocate for girls' education. That was after the Taliban targeted her, and, well, she ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Talk about making your voice heard globally.
Yeah, and she was the youngest person to ever win it, too.
Unbelievable.
And her quote, the one about raising her voice so that those without a voice can be heard, it's incredibly powerful. It really captures what we're talking about here.
It really does. And then there's Greta Thunberg, who's using social media to take her climate protests global.
Right.
And Tarana Burke, the #MeToo movement.
It all started online, bringing global awareness to sexual harassment. These are just a few examples, but they really highlight how the internet is changing things. It's giving a voice to people who might have never been heard before. And it's not just about speaking up, it's about actually driving change. These women, they've inspired millions, they've sparked movements that are making a real difference.
You're right, it's not just words, it's action. And it shows how much individuals can accomplish, even when they're up against huge challenges. But it does make me think about the contrast we started with. Women in Afghanistan being silenced, and then people like Richardson finding these global audiences and even finding financial success through these online platforms. It's a powerful example of how power dynamics work in the world today.
And what's really interesting is I think the internet, it's shaking up those traditional power structures. It lets individuals bypass the gatekeepers, the people who used to control who gets heard and who doesn't. And that's huge. You can reach a global audience now, build your own influence in ways that just weren't possible before.
So it's almost like a democratization of voice.
It is, in a way.
But that also brings up a lot of important questions, right? Like, how do we make sure everyone has equal access to these platforms? And then you think about the downsides, like the spread of misinformation.
What of the hate speech?
Yeah, we can't just ignore those problems.
No, you're right. It's definitely complex. We need to be aware of, the incredible potential, but also the risks that come with these technologies.
It's a balancing act.
It is. And it requires all of us to think critically about how we're using these platforms and how they're shaping, our world.
How they're shaping our world, yeah.
But I think what's important to remember is that technology by itself, it's neutral. It's how we use it that really matters. And I think, the sources we looked at, they show how technology can be used to create real change, positive change.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot here. We've talked about the silencing of women in Afghanistan, the struggle for gender parity in leadership, the rise of these digital voices. There's so much to think about. But what stands out most to you?
I think what really hits home for me is the resilience of people, especially women. They refuse to be silenced, whether they're fighting for their rights in Afghanistan or navigating those challenges of leadership in male-dominated industries or using digital platforms to make a difference. There's just the spirit of determination that comes through in all of these sources. And honestly, it's really inspiring, and it gives me hope for the future.
I agree. It really highlights how important it is to create those spaces where those voices can be heard. We've seen the impact that can have.
Absolutely. And I think we all have a responsibility to create those spaces, whether it's in our workplaces, in our communities, or even just in our daily interactions. Even small actions can make a difference.
So let's talk about that. What can we do, as individuals to make a difference? Where do we even begin?
That's a great question. And one that we're going to dive into in the next part of this deep dive. Thinking about these issues of voice and representation, our sources really point to the importance of leadership, especially in a global context. I think there are some really powerful lessons here for business leaders, particularly those who are looking to make a positive impact.
It's true. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by how big these issues are, but leaders, they really do play a crucial role. So what does that kind of leadership actually look like in this context? What are we talking about?
Well, first off, it starts with understanding the value of diverse perspectives, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've been talking about how women's voices are often, they're silenced or overlooked. And that applies to other marginalized groups, too. So creating a culture where everyone feels safe speaking up, sharing their ideas, even challenging the way things are, that's where it all begins.
So instead of surrounding yourself with people who always agree with you, it's more about seeking out those voices that are often missing. And then creating opportunities for them to actually be heard.
Exactly. And it's not just about inviting them to the table,
Right.
right? It's about really listening to what they have to say, considering their perspective, even when it's different from your own.
I can imagine that could be, a little uncomfortable, especially for leaders who are used to, calling the shots. It's about being willing to step back and give up some of that control
Yeah.
and maybe embrace a more collaborative approach.
I think you're right on with that. It really is a mindset shift, right? It's less about I'm in charge and more about empowering other people. Leadership isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about creating an environment where the best ideas can surface, whoever they come from.
That makes sense. But how does this global perspective, how does that tie into all of this?
Well, look at the sources. They're all about how interconnected our world is, right? Well, what's happening in one place, like, the restrictions on women in Afghanistan, those things, they don't just stay there. They have ripple effects. They impact everything. From global security to economic development, it's all connected.
So it's not just about knowing what's happening in other countries. It's about understanding how those events, those policies, those cultural shifts, they all tie into our own lives and our own work.
Exactly. We're all part of this global ecosystem, right? And the sources really highlight that. Our actions, even the small ones, they can have consequences that reach far beyond what we might imagine.
This is starting to feel a lot less abstract and a lot more like something we can actually do something about. So, if I'm a business leader and I'm listening to this, what are some steps I can take to really cultivate that global perspective and empower diverse voices within my organization? What can I actually do?
Well, first and foremost, you got to educate yourself. Make an effort to learn about different cultures, perspectives, global issues. There are so many resources out there, tons of them. Books, articles, documentaries, podcasts. I mean, the list goes on. And connect with people, people from different backgrounds, learn from their experiences.
That's great advice. And it's about building a diverse team, right? Not just hiring people who are like you.
Absolutely. That diversity of thought, it's crucial. It's how you innovate. It's how you solve problems. It's how you make better decisions when you have people from different backgrounds and with different perspectives working together. Well, you're just more likely to come up with creative solutions that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
And of course, it's about creating that culture of inclusivity, where everyone feels valued and respected.
Yeah.
And that means fostering open communication, active listening, giving and receiving feedback.
All those things, they're crucial for a healthy work environment,
Yeah.
a productive one. And, I think it's important to remember that this is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
There's always more to learn, always new ways to grow, new perspectives to consider.
This has been so insightful. We've talked about global leadership, we've talked about the value of diverse perspectives, creating that culture of inclusivity.
Yes.
So from your perspective, what's the biggest takeaway for our listeners? What's the one thing you want them to really remember?
If I had to sum it all up, it would be this. Ambition dies when a voice is lost.
Wow, that's a powerful statement. What do you mean by that?
Think about everything we've been talking about. When voices are silenced, when perspectives are ignored, it doesn't just stifle individual potential, it limits everyone. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility, I think, to make space for others to be heard, particularly those who have been, marginalized or overlooked. Everyone has something to contribute, and our world is a much richer, more vibrant place when we embrace all of those experiences. That's where real progress happens. That's where innovation comes from.
Ambition dies when a voice is lost.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought, and something I think we need to keep in mind. It's on all of us to lift up those voices, those perspectives that are often overlooked, especially those that have been silenced or marginalized.
It all comes back to that power of voice, right? We've seen how it can be taken away, how it can be amplified, how it can be a real force for change in the world. But at the end of the day, it comes down to each of us. How are we using our own voices? What will you use yours for? So what can our listeners do? What are some concrete steps they can take to make sure that their voices are heard? And not just their own. How can we amplify the voices of others?
Well, I think first it's about recognizing that you do have a voice and it matters. What are you passionate about? What issues are important to you? Once you figure that out, then you can find ways to express yourself, to share what you care about.
That could mean, I don't know, writing a blog post, volunteering for a cause you believe in, or even just talking to friends and family about these issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding those platforms, those ways of communicating that work for you and then using them, right? To share your perspective, your ideas, your stories.
And we can't forget about listening, right? Making space for other people to share their experiences, even when those experiences are different from our own.
Absolutely. Listening, it's just as important as speaking, maybe even more so. It's how we learn, how we grow, how we start to understand each other better. And you never know, you might just learn something new or gain a totally fresh perspective that you wouldn't have considered before.
This deep dive has been, wow, it's been really eye-opening. I mean, we've gone from the silencing of women in Afghanistan to the challenges of achieving gender parity in leadership, the power of those digital platforms, the role global leaders play in all of this. There's so much to consider, but I think one thing is clear. We all have a role to play in creating a world where every voice matters.
The world burns. Find your global voice. Speak where it counts.
I love that. A real call to action for all of us. And for our listeners, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you from this deep dive? What actions are you going to take to make sure that your voice is heard and that you're helping to amplify the voices of others? Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep using your voice to make a difference.